What's going on, everybody? This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministry, and the title of today's video is The Book of Revelation, Part 1. So I'm going to be doing what I'm hoping is going to be a two-part summary of the contents of the Book of Revelation. It may be as many as 3 parts, and this is the first time that I've ever done really a series of videos. But this is something that I've been thinking about doing for a little while, and as I was praying this week, I felt led that this should be the topic of the next Bible study video that I'm going to do outside. So we're going to be taking a break from the Nephilim and the cryptids for a few videos, which is fine. And we're going to be going into a Bible study on how I personally view the book of Revelation. And I want to kind of, in this specific video, part 1, I want to introduce the book of Revelation, and I want to give the various views of how it's interpreted. And and then I'm going to try to start going through it, and I'm going to see how far I'm going to get. My goal is to cover the beginning of the book today, and then give a summary for the epistles in the first few chapters and get to the seals. But maybe we won't even get as far as that. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. But I want to start by just talking about my thought process for why I want to do this video, because we're living in strange times, we're living in turbulent times, and many Christians are asking the question, how do the things that we see in our world tie into Bible prophecy? And I rejoice that Christians are doing that. And in you know in a lot of circles, the most popular view is the dispensationalist view of the book of Revelation, of Bible prophecy in general. And there's many wonderful brethren who are dispensationalists. I do not hold that perspective myself, but there's a lot of Christians who, on a lot of different topics, they hold that view, and I've appreciated their emphases on theology as a whole, and even at times certain things they say about eschatology. Even if I don't agree with everything, I appreciate their emphases, and that's probably the most popular view in Reformed circles. And I consider myself a part of the Reformed tradition theologically. I'm a Calvinist. I hold to the 5 points of Calvinism. Most people in those circles are either going to be, they're amillennialists, usually holding to what's called the idealist view of the book of Revelation. I'll define that more in a second. But they see things very symbolically. They see the book of Revelation describing things in a very symbolic sense, but it's not very literal or talking about specific historical events the way some of the other views do. And then another common viewpoint in the Reform camp is the partial preterist perspective, where they see everything as being fulfilled, kind of leading up to 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that's a really common viewpoint. Most people who hold to a post-millennial view of the millennium today interpret the book of Revelation from a preterist perspective. But then I hold to the view what's called the historicist viewpoint, and that's the view that believes that the book of Revelation is essentially a timeline of prophetic events from the first century AD to the end, the return of Christ in the eternal state. And that the book of Revelation, in my view, is like a scroll that's being unraveled gradually throughout the centuries. And it's a more or less largely chronological sequence of events. And I believe that the book of Revelation is fulfilled by literal historical events. So I'm going to be talking about that today, and I'm excited to give this perspective again. I've talked about it in some of my other videos, but I always avoided the book of Revelation, not because I'm ashamed of it, but I knew it's such a big thing to get into. I knew it'd be very, very hard to give a good summary of the contents of the book in one section. So I've always kind of talked about other things. I've talked about the book of Daniel. I did a video on the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. I've talked about my view of the millennium. I've talked about my view of the Antichrist. Historicists believe that the Antichrist is the popes of Rome, that dynasty of the papacy, the Roman papacy, the popes, and that the Roman Catholic system, that false church system, which has corrupted the true biblical church of Christianity with their idolatry and their paganism and their veneration of Mary and the saints and the veneration of the popes, that system is mystery Babylon. It's the false church system. And that's really how I view the book of Revelation. And I don't say that it's not that's not intended to be anti-Catholicism, or it's not, the goal isn't to harness hatred toward everybody, anybody. But I think the reason why that perspective was held by so many godly men is they saw that Satan had brought corruptions into the professing church, and that Bible prophecy was recognizing that, because the Bible has very strict prohibition against images of God, images of Christ, of idolatry and idols, and all of that stuff in the from the pagan Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. All of that came into the church, and God was displeased with it. So therefore, it would make a lot of sense that that was foretold by Bible prophecy. So that's really where it's coming from. And the historicist view, I'm going to start by defining all four views here. I've just mentioned about them all, but the his but before I even get to that, I'll define them in a second. I want to make this comment that it's very, very important for us to understand that apart from really the only view of eschatology that I think is quote heretical, which is quote out of bounds for a Christian to hold, is what's called the full preterist view. And that's the view that denies that they think Jesus has already come, the return of Christ has already happened, the bodily resurrection has already happened. They think all Bible prophecy is completely fulfilled, and therefore, they're not looking forward to a future bodily resurrection or the final judgment. They think we essentially, if you're a Christian, you die and you go to heaven and be with Christ. And they think that we are in the new heavens right now because they believe all Bible prophecy is fulfilled. And I would say, as a Christian, an Orthodox Bible believing Christian, you cannot hold that view, because Paul in the New Testament is very specific that our hope is intricately tied to our future bodily resurrection. That in the eternal state, we're going to be given new bodies. And we are all, as Christians, looking forward to the return of Christ. And it says, even in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, every eye will see Jesus when he comes back down. So we know that that hasn't happened yet. I know that the full preterist apologists may push back and say, oh, there's really good reason to believe that. They always make reference to certain verses they call the timestamps and whatever else. But I think that's really the only view that's out of bounds. I've had good fellowship with partial preterists, postmillennialists. I'm a historicist postmillennialist, so even though we don't agree on everything, we can we've had good fellowship on some of our aspects of how we see the millennium and certain aspects of how we see the church advancing in the latter day, et cetera, et cetera. I've had good fellowship with idealists, amillennialists. I've had good fellowship with futurist dispensationalists, and I'm going to define all this a little bit more in a second. But here's the point I'm trying to make, guys, is that we need to have humility and we need to be gracious with each other. This is true for theology as a whole, but this is especially true when talking about Bible prophecy and eschatology, because as long as we're not disavowing the core doctrines of the faith, the faith, and if we're not denying this is true for theology in general, if we should be very gracious with each other if we're disagreeing on secondary issues. I think this is especially true in regards to Bible prophecy, because it's complicated, it's complex. You need to have I think to be a good student of eschatology, you need to be a good student of systematic theology first, because there's a lot of doctrines that are going to undergird how you view a lot of issues. So you really need to have a very good grasp of the breadth of Scripture, how all these prophecies relate to each other, because there's prophecies in the Old Testament, there's prophecies in the New Testament. We can read prophecies that have already been fulfilled historically. We have prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled. So there needs to be a lot of humility. And I've had good fellowship with people in the different camps. I've also had some bad experiences with people from different perspectives. I had some bad experiences with some people who hold to the idealist amillennial view, and they, even though they didn't say it in so many words, their attitude was essentially, if you hold to any view other than their own, they would essentially look down on you. And I had some conversations that were just not encouraging, and they were very discouraging conversations when I was trying very hard to not be argumentative, but just ask questions of their view and try to have some good interactions. And I had some bad interactions, and I had that same thing happen with some dispensationalist futurists, where I've had that happen, where if you're not a dispensationalist, you're viewed as essentially a liberal. And that dispensationalism, and that's been the attitude in fundamentalist circles for a long, long time, that if you're not a dispensationalist futurist, if that's not the view you hold, then pretty much all the other views are liberalism or, at best, lukewarm Christianity at best. And really, the only view is acceptable is the futurist dispensationalist view. And the point I'm making here, you can have good interactions with people of different schools. You can have bad interactions with people of different schools. But at the end of the day, as long as you're in bounds, which most views are, the what's going to lead to good or bad conversations isn't necessarily the view you're holding, but it's the humility or the lack thereof. And so I really wanted to start in this place. I know it's taken me a few minutes to get going here, but I just wanted to start with that because we need to have graciousness when we're talking with each other about eschatology because it's complicated and it's complex, and we need to lay that foundation. So that being said, so the dispensationalist school is the most popular school of eschatology, and it's also often called the futurist perspective of Bible prophecy because they view the book of Revelation as prophesying this future 7-year tribulation, and that they see that the book of Revelation is all being more or less fulfilled in the future. So hence it's why it's called the futurist school. Many dispensationalist theologians, they'll say the epistles are prophesying 7 church ages, and then everything from chapter 4 through 6, the seals onward is the tribulation. So futurism, dispensationalism puts everything in the future. Now, preterism, in contrast, and there's partial preterism and there's full preterism. Partial preterism is an orthodox position. As I said before, full preterism, I would say, is heretical. And the preterists say they believe that the book of Revelation is talking about events leading up to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. And therefore, they believe that the book of Revelation is written before 70 AD. They usually will date it around 66 AD. And therefore, they see the beast as the Roman Emperor Nero, in contrast to the futurists who usually say it's some future up and coming politician who is the Antichrist. But the beast and the Antichrist, according to preterists, is usually Nero. That's usually the identity they give. And they see the beast as the pagan Roman Empire. So in contrast, so like I said that the beast would be referring to papal Rome. I'll get to that in a bit. But the preterists would say it's referring to the pagan Roman Empire, and they think that the Antichrist is Nero, and they see the tribulation, some of the tribulations in the book of Revelation is pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem. And we know that the destruction of Jerusalem was a very, very big event talked about in the scriptures. It is a big prophetic event. When you read the Olivet Discourse, there's clearly reference, in my opinion, to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So partial preterists, in my opinion, they don't get everything wrong. I don't agree with them on all points, but with some of the things they talk about in the Bible, I can see where they're coming to. The thing that one of the views that many partial preterist theologians hold, which I think can get problematic, is they see the last days as being in reference to not the final era of church history as a whole, but they would say they often will define it as, oh, it's the last days leading up to 70 AD, which I think if you define the last days that way, that can have you leap into full preterism. So you got to be careful. I mean, that's a whole, how we define the last days is a whole topic in of itself. But I see the last days as really talking about all of history from the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ. If you want to think about it, all of history leading up to the first advent of Christ is kind of like the rising of the sun. It's, even though the Bible doesn't use this term, you could kind of view it as the first days or the opening days. And then I see the last days as all of the history from the first advent to the end. So if the first portion of history is like the rising of the sun, in my view, I think the last days is referring to this epoch of history that we're in, which is the setting of the sun. And everything leading up to Christ coming was the sun going up, like I said, and then everything after his coming is the sun going down of our world, of our history. And you don't, when I'm saying that, that's kind of an illustration. So it doesn't mean that Christ literally has to be at the literal center in the sense that it's going to be like the perfect same amount of years before and after. But in a general sense, the coming of Christ is the very center of history, the first coming of Christ. And so I see the last days as all of the epoch following the last days. But that being said, so I define futurism and I define preterism, and then you get to idealism. And idealism, people who hold to the idealist view of interpreting scripture, they usually will be amillennial in their view of the millennium, and they view the book, as I said, as the book of Revelation has spiritual principles. That's their word. You see this when you read their literature that applies to the church. They don't like the term allegory, even though people in other schools have accused them of allegory, and I'll let people decide. But they view the book as having symbolism, which it does, and they really avoid, they would say that it's being fulfilled historically, but it's very general. So they see the seals and the trumpets, talking about judgments on the world or tribulation for the church, and they say that as the church age progresses, the intensity of those tribulations increase. But it's very, very vague, very general. So in contrast to the futurist school, which would be uh, very, very nitty gritty, or the historicist school, which is very, very nitty gritty and literal historical application, the idealist school is very general, very symbolic, and so they avoid uh, literal historical applications for specific things. It's all fulfilled in a more symbolic and general sense. Some theologians that hold that perspective, if you read William Hendrickson's book on it, I don't have it in front of me. William Hendrickson is a very common advocate for the idealist school, and there are others as well. And like I said before, all of them, all of the schools of thought, they all have their strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion. I would say the idealist school, even though I get where they're coming from with the symbolism, it's been probably the one I would disagree with the most. I don't know if I don't mean to be uncharitable. Might even say it's the weakest because, in my opinion, Bible prophecy is historical events being foretold before they happen. And when you read Bible prophecy all throughout the Bible, when you read about how it's interpreted or how it was applied or how it was fulfilled, it's usually very, very detailed in its historical application. So I don't know why the book of Revelation would be really any different than all of the rest of the books. And so there's great idealists on Millennial Brothers, guys, and maybe some of you watching are that, and I respect that, but I just I really have personally struggled with that viewpoint. I think it's a very academically safe viewpoint because if you don't make specific predictions, it's in contrast to dispensationalists who have made, dispensationalism is usually called newspaper eschatology. I don't think that's completely unfair. They're usually looking for how things are going to be fulfilled. And that's not necessarily wrong either. I mean, we should be paying attention to the signs and paying attention to what's going on in the world. But the amillennials are very distant from that idea of looking at current events and trying to read it into Bible prophecy. They're really on the far end of that spectrum where they try to avoid that as much as possible. Now we come to the view I hold, the historicist school. And obviously, I'm going to have a little bias because the view I hold to, but I'm trying to be objective in summarizing the four views. That historicism, it believes that prophecy is literal historical events before they happen. So when we interpret the symbols, there is much symbolism in Bible prophecy that we should it should be interpreted with literal historical events. So that's the first pillar of historicism. The second pillar is that the book of Revelation is essentially a prophetic timeline from the first coming of Christ to the end of the world in the eternal state. So I really see it as the early chapters really start in the first century AD when the book is written, and then the later chapter 21 and 22 is the eternal state, in my opinion. Chapter 20 is the millennium and the little season. The little season is the final era before the eternal state. And everything in between that is fulfilled gradually throughout the century. So historicism believes that the book of Revelation is a timeline from the first coming of Christ to the end of the world. that prophecy is fulfilled by literal historical events, and the third distinctive of it is always that the Antichrist is identified as the Pope of Rome. It's not just one specific Pope of Rome, but it's really that the Antichrist is a title, and every single pope who sits on his throne in Rome is at the time of his reign is the Antichrist. Kind of how every president we have while he's in the Oval Office is the president. So George Bush was the president, and then when Barack Obama came in, he was the president, and then Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So it's a succession. Each one is while he's in the office is the president. And so it's the same with the kings of England. So that's really how you view the Antichrist. And then, like I said, Mystery Babylon is the false church system, which I see being essentially fulfilled by the papacy and by Roman Catholicism, because that's really the religious system that reflects the corruption that came into the church over many centuries. So I think historicism talks about a lot of specific historical events. I think the early chapters talk a lot about things relating to the decline and then eventually the fall of the Roman Empire, which we're going to talk about today. And it talks about things like the persecution of Christians in the early centuries. I think it talks about the fall of paganism in the Roman Empire. And then as you get into more of the Middle Ages, I think it talks about the political fall of the Roman Empire and then the rise of Islam. And then as you get to the latter portions of the book, especially with the vials, which will be talked about in the next video, it specifically starts to talk about the decline and the fall of the papal system. So the early chapters is pagan Rome, and the latter chapters are papal Rome, pagan Rome and papal Rome. And when you look at the seals and the vials, or the seals and the trumpets and the vials, you see similarities between them. That's why people say in the idealist school, they actually believe that these things are talking about the same events from differing perspectives. So they have that's what's called progressive parallelism. You can look that up. Guys like William Hendrickson held that view. And so they would say, instead of this being chronological, they would say it's the same thing happening over and over again, but it's being shown from different perspectives, which is interesting. I don't necessarily see it that way. But in my opinion, the reason why you see some of those similarities is because the early events can, in a typological way, kind of point forward and shadow at what's going to happen in the later events, even though they're separate events. And types and antitypes is a fascinating topic. You see it all throughout the scriptures. And I think to understand Bible prophecy, it is very helpful to have an understanding of typology, types and antitypes. A type is a sign or symbol in the Bible which always has a corresponding sign or symbol of greater significance. That's called the antitype. So, for example, the sacrifices of the Old Testament point forward to the perfect sacrifice of Christ. You have Adam, and then you have the second Adam, which is Christ, a type and an antitype. And there's so many of these that you could talk about. The world being destroyed by the great flood of Noah. We've talked about that a lot on this channel in recent months. That typologically points forward to the end of the world when the world is purged by fire. That's in 2 Peter chapter 3. So types and antitypes. One judgment prophetically points forward to another judgment. And this just is all throughout Scripture. It's just on and on and on and on. And so, but anyway, I digress. So anyway, I want to talk about, so here are some of the reasons. I'm going to give some reasons why I hold to the historicist perspective. I'm going to show some resources on the historicist perspective. And then from there, I'll get into starting to kind of unravel and go through the book of Revelation. So my goal is really to summarize in this video chapter 1 and then talk about the epistles and the seals a little bit. And then the next video, I'm going to do the trumpets, the vials, and I'll probably talk a little bit about the millennium and the eternal state. Because once you get to chapters 20 through 22, that's where you get to the millennium and the eternal state. But this video, we're really going to try to get up to the seals. But why do I hold to the historicist perspective? Well, like I said, I think that historicism, the principle of historicism is this. Some prophetic events have been interpreted in the past. Some prophetic events are being interpreted right now. And some prophetic events are going to be fulfilled in the future. And depending on where you are in history, you're going to be further along down the prophetic timeline. And that to me just makes sense. So the preterist perspective essentially puts all Bible prophecy in the first century, 70 AD, or at the very least, the vast majority of it. The futurist perspective with the book of Revelation is putting everything at this final tribulation at the end. And with both these views, you're going to have huge gaps of history that are not covered. And so it makes sense to me that every era of history would more or less be covered prophetically. It doesn't mean every single individual historical event is covered, but what it does mean is that every epoch of history essentially has some type of prophetic reference to it. And that makes perfect sense. So that's one reason why I would hold to the historicist perspective, because you're not putting it's not there's not an overemphasis on the beginning or an overemphasis on the end. I think preterism and futurism are both there. To use that illustration, they both lean too much to one side or to the other side, where historicism, because it covers a lot of history, it really holds everything, so it's a more balanced position in that sense. And I've also heard it said by historicist theologians that historicism is like Bible prophecy is like history being foretold in hieroglyphs. So it's being foretold in symbolism, but it's applied in literal historical events, like I said before. And once again, that just makes so much sense, because I think the historicist view can account for the symbolism in the book of Revelation without interpreting things literalistically, but how you interpret it in terms of the historical event is literal. So it can account for the symbolism and the literal application in the way that the Bible itself, allowing Scripture to interpret Scripture, it once again is a balanced view that makes sense. Where some people would have accused dispensationalists of interpreting everything so literally, almost to the point of literalism, they're saying there's helicopters and stuff in the Bible, in the book of Revelation. And like in some ways that's fair, some ways that's not fair. And in idealism, which is everything's just symbolic. And once again, I think historicism is a very balanced view. And then the other thing that I would say, that when you interpret the book of Revelation in that way, you're interpreting it pretty much the same way Bible prophecy has been interpreted throughout the rest of the Bible. When you read all the prophecies and the major and minor prophets about the first coming of Christ, they were written before the fulfillment, and it would have been very hard. We live after the first coming of Christ, so it would now we're able to look at the historical context and understand the interpretation of it. But if you lived before Christ had come and you've read those prophecies, it was still kind of in the shadows. You couldn't make out what it meant yet, and you needed historical context to understand the fulfillment of those prophecies. So if we interpret the book of Revelation in that way, it's referring to literal historical events, and we may not understand it until the events are fulfilled. That makes perfect sense. We're interpreting the book of Revelation the same way we interpret the other parts of our Bible. Now, some people, they don't like to interpret Bible prophecy in this way because it requires knowledge of history. And as much as I understand that objection, and people would say, well, yeah, the common man, if he isn't an expert in history, can't understand Bible prophecy. And as much as I can sympathize with that statement and understand where someone's coming from, I would say, well, unfortunately, that's what Bible prophecy is. And understanding the Bible has always been work. And, if you go into a theologian's house, he's going to have a lot of Bible commentaries on his shelf, and they're usually going to have a lot of history in them, because you need the history to understand the Bible. The Bible is a very historical book, and I think that's true for Bible prophecy as much as anything else. So all of that kind of shows that yes, it is a book that it's historical events being foretold through hieroglyphics or symbolism, if you want to use that term. But it's always the fulfillment of it is literal historical events. That's historicism in a nutshell, and that just makes sense to me. And having every era essentially covered makes a lot of sense to me. So that's why I'm not a preterist and I'm not a futurist. I would hold to the historicist view of eschatology. And people get really worked up about eschatology, but part of the reason I wanted to do this video was there's not a lot of resources on historicism out there. There's some people who do a good job talking about it, but hopefully this will provide a good introduction to understanding historicism. And I want to recommend some resources here. Not to self-aggrandize, but my first book I actually wrote is on eschatology, and it's called Lost Eschatology: Our Protestant Heritage Recovered, An Introduction to Historicist Postmillennialism. And the reason why I call this perspective lost eschatology, because it's the view that was held for hundreds of years by Protestant theologians. It's our Protestant heritage from an eschatology standpoint. So Luther and Calvin and the Puritans and guys like Jonathan Edwards and Spurgeon and Ryle, even though they would disagree amongst themselves about certain specifics of Bible prophecy, they all interpreted the book essentially through the historicist perspective. But from the 20th century onward, it's essentially fallen out of favor, and it's a very minority held view. And so that's why I call it lost eschatology. But this book is really just supposed to be a summary, an introduction to it, just to give people a viewpoint on it and to let people know what it is. So that's why I wrote this book. And one of the things I say in the beginning of the book is that it's very important before you go into a polemic for any given view is you need to give what I just did, give an introduction to all the views so everybody can have all their options in front of them and they can choose which one makes the most sense to them. Because the goal I have is not necessarily to give a polemic, even though I have my opinions on it. My goal is to give all the information to people and let them sift it out and figure out what they think is the right perspective. So that's the book I wrote on it, but I really want to show you some of the resources which I use to come to the view I held. If you're interested in this book though, it is listed, the link to the Amazon, this is on the Amazon store. You can put it in the search box, Lost Eschatology by Joe Harper, or the link to this is on my website under the books, under the section called Our Books. But this is a very good book introducing the historicist perspective called Romanism and the Reformation from the standpoint of Bible prophecy. And this is from a guy called Henry Grattan Guinness, who was an evangelist in Northern Ireland. He was a Protestant evangelist. And he wrote a number of books on historicism from the historicist premillennial perspective. And I really, even though I would hold to the historicist postmillennial perspective, I really appreciated his books. He did a good job talking about why the beast from the historicist perspective is Romanism, Roman Catholicism, the papacy. He does a good job explaining the viewpoint. This is a pretty easy read. So if you're looking for something to introduce you to the standpoint of Bible prophecy, you can find this. Now, Henry Grattan Guinness's books, there's a website called historicism.com, and that gives the historicist premillennial perspective on that website. And they have Henry Grattan Guinness's books on there in PDF format. And I really appreciate that website. That's a good website. So I think it's still up. I actually have the link to it in the websites I recommend on my website. I'm pretty sure it's still on there. And then here is volume 1 of what is actually a 4-volume commentary set by E.B. Elliott, and this is called Horae Apocalyptae. So that's Latin. I know I pronounce Latin awful, so bear with me. But E.B. Elliott, he wrote a 4-volume commentary on the Book of Revelation from the historicist perspective, and he does an excellent job as you're going through the seals and the trumpets and the vials, which we're going to be talking about here. He does a great job giving all of the historical context to why he holds the views he does, and it's a very in-depth resource, and it's very, very good. It's very, very helpful. And when I found out about this book when I was reading Charles Spurgeon's list of Bible commentaries called Commenting on Commentaries, which I know sounds like a list of Bible commentaries. That sounds really dry, but when Spurgeon wrote it, he actually has a lot of humor in his list where he's talking about, oh, I have my Calvinist commentary set is written by John Gill, and he calls him almost a hyper Calvinist. And he goes, oh, and I have my Arminian commentary set, and the two disagree. That Arminian commentary set he talks about is written by Adam Clarke, and he said, well, John Calvin is kind of in between them, so I stick them right in between the two so that they can be at peace and be at friends with each other. And Spurgeon, he's talking about these commentaries and he's giving them rankings, and he actually has humor that's funny in the commentary. So he takes a topic, a list of commentaries, something that would be really dry and boring, and he actually inserts some color and humor into it where it's actually interesting to read. And I remember when I was getting really fired up about theology for the first time in my early 20s, and I was starting to Google theologians. I learned about Spurgeon, and I wanted to buy some commentaries. I ended up buying Matthew Henry and a Matthew Poole and a John Gill commentary set, and yeah, I spent some money on those, and they're still sitting on my shelf, and you can find them for, which is ironic because you can pretty much find them all for free online. They're all good. My favorites are John Gill and Matthew Poole, but I read Spurgeon's list commenting on commentary, and I was like, wow, this guy's actually pretty funny, which is why I like Spurgeon. Anyway, to my main point though, when he was talking about commentaries he recommends for the book of Revelation, he recommends this book because Spurgeon was a historicist, and he said you should read this commentary set, and that's how I learned about it, was through Spurgeon's commenting on commentaries for the book of Revelation. Now, when you go online and you look up commenting on commentaries online, there's like a longer version of it which has that listed, and then there was a shorter version I found at one point which actually didn't have this listed, and I was kind of annoyed by it at one point. But if you find Spurgeon's full writings on commenting on commentaries and you go to the book of Revelation, it'll say Horaic Apocalypticae by E.B. Elliott. And E.B. Elliott was a Anglican scholar, and he was a historicist, and he held to a premillennial view of the millennium. Now, this is a very interesting little book. This is Jonathan Edwards. This is from his Yale set. So if you buy the works of Jonathan Edwards, there's the 2-volume Banner of Truth set, and it's amazing how small the print is on those books. And there's a lot of stuff by Edwards that isn't in that. But then there's like the more expansive 22-volume Yale set of Jonathan Edwards' writings, and it has a ton of stuff in those books. Very, very expensive to buy them all. But one of the volumes that he has in the expansive works of Jonathan Edwards this is volume 5, his apocalyptic writings, his notes on the apocalypse, or the notes on the book of Revelation. And even though it's a little academic and it's Jonathan Edwards, so if you know anything about church history, you know what you're getting into. But his insights from a historicist post-millennial perspective is very, very interesting. It's fascinating. And if you're looking for something a little bit more in depth, this is a pretty good book. Oh, and the one I don't have in front of me, I should have brought it, is one of my favorite commentary sets on the book of Revelation. I think my favorite, I should have it here in front of me, is Wilhelmus Abrakel's commentary on the book of Revelation. You know what? Hang on, guys. I'm going to be right back, so stay tuned. So here's the one here's the commentary by Wilhelmus Abrakel I was talking about. This is called Not to Be Ignored. This is his commentary on Revelation. Now, Wilhelmus Abrakel, he was a theologian in what's called the Dutch Further Reformation, so he was a theologian from the Netherlands. He also has a very good systematic theology, 4 volumes, called The Christian's Reasonable Service, and there's a very good section on the future salvation of the Jews in Romans 11, and I would hold to a future conversion for the Jews in Romans 11. Some theologians would not hold to that. I think Romans 11 is pretty clear on that, in my opinion. But yeah, Abrakel, him and Jonathan Edwards, so these are 2 post-millennial, historicist post-millennial theologians that I would recommend. And I like this commentary a lot because it's very, very easy to read. It's been translated into English from Dutch, and it's very, very easy to approach, and I find that very helpful. But him and Edwards, they would hold the exact same view. The stuff that Jonathan Edwards, there's parts of some little differences in like the seals and the vial. They're essentially coming at the book of Revelation from the exact same perspective of eschatology, and that's helpful. But yeah, Jonathan Edwards is a really brilliant mind, one of the theologians that was extremely influential during the First Great Awakening. And he was another theologian that's really brilliant, and I think some of his views on eschatology are not as well understood by the church today as they could be. And obviously everybody knows he's post-millennial, but they don't really get into the nitty-gritty of his historicism, which I think historicism is really the foundation for the whole thing, in my opinion. Well, yeah, as you notice here, I have some books from the premillennial perspective that are helpful. There's good books from the postmillennial perspective, but they're all historicism. They all see the book of Revelation as a timeline, like I said, of church history and of history of the world in general, because some of the events talked about in the book of Revelation are political in nature. And that's really the foundation for coming at all that. So that's really the starting point for this, and I think that that's really where things should start. And I think, guys, I said I was going to get into the epistles and the seals, but I think I'm probably going to stop the video here. This may be a three-parter, but this is really just the introduction to all of the views, and I don't want to overwhelm everybody with information. I don't want to make it too long, but like I said, I think a really good point is before you come to your view on any given point, you should really familiarize yourself with all of the viewpoints before you make a judgment. I think especially oftentimes dispensationalists, they'll present their view, and I've read books where they present their view and they don't even mention the fact that there's other views, or there may be a very brief mention, but you know they'll say, well, people will say, well, what does the Bible say about Bible prophecy? And they'll talk about the 7 year tribulation, the pre-trib rapture, and the future Antichrist. And it's almost as if the other views never existed. And I don't think that's very fair. And I'm not saying this to cast stones at the dispensationalists. There's some good people who hold that view. But I think the point I am trying to make is that you gotta start with all the views and laying them out. And so in the next video, I'll start going through the contents of the book. But this video is really just supposed to be an introduction to the views, an introduction to really preterism and futurism and historicism, and really laying the table for going through this material in more detail. So we're going to go through the epistles, the seals, the trumpets, the vials, and the eternal state. So that's going to be the goal for the video, which I'll put up the following week and week. So that's really where we're going to go. That's the goal for this series of videos. This is the first series I've ever done. If you like what I'm doing here, let me know down in the comments. If you like what's going on with this channel, subscribe to the work. A lot of what I've been talking about lately has not been, we do Bible studies here, but a lot of it's about the Nephilim, about cryptids. This has become a research ministry, and I'm hoping to go back out into the wilds and explore the world again this spring and summer. So if you like what you're doing, subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth and Ministry. God bless everybody. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.